Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this session, I will be dealing with thalamus. Before we move on to thalamus proper, we should know what is thalamus, where is it located, and what are the subdivisions of thalamus. We know when we talk about brain, we have forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. In the forebrain, we have two subdivisions. One is known as telencephalon, and the other one is known as diencephalon. Telencephalon, we know it is from the telencephalon we have the two cerebral hemispheres developed, and below that you have the diencephalon. So I think now it's clear for you where the thalamus is located. So thalamus is just located below. You have the cerebral hemisphere like this. You have the thalamus, a group of grey matter, situated just below the cerebral hemisphere, and it is actually seated on the midbrain. So it is between the cerebral hemisphere above and the midbrain below. And it is separated from the midbrain by a very small group of nuclei known as subthalamus. So once again, we have forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. In the forebrain, we have two subdivisions. One is telencephalon and the other one is diencephalon. And it is from this diencephalon you have the thalamus derived. So this is actually a sagittal section which you will be seeing when you cut the corpus callosum, and in the sagittal section you can see this whole thing is the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, and below the cerebral hemisphere you can see a mass of grey matter which is seated between the cerebral hemisphere, and this part is known as the midbrain. Okay, so below you have the midbrain and above you have the cerebral hemisphere. Between these two you have a mass of grey matter that is known as thalamus. Now there are two openings when you look in this aspect. One is the interventricular foramen which you will be getting between the two lateral ventricles, and the other one is actually the rostral end or the cranial end of the cerebral aqueduct which is actually passing through the midbrain. So suppose if you draw a line connecting these two, that is the interventricular foramen and the cerebral aqueduct, the rostral end, you call this sulcus as hypothalamic sulcus. So this mass of grey matter is actually further divided into a part which is lying dorsal to this sulcus and a part which is lying ventral to this sulcus. So the part which is lying dorsal to the sulcus, you call it as pars dorsalis, and the part which is lying ventral to this sulcus, you call it as pars ventralis. So this whole group is known as diencephalon. Okay, so telencephalon and diencephalon, the two parts of forebrain, and you have the diencephalon which is further divided into pars dorsalis and pars ventralis by the hypothalamic sulcus. Now let's see what are the components of pars dorsalis and pars ventralis. Suppose you take pars dorsalis first. It has got three components. One is the thalamus which we are going to deal with. Then you have the metathalamus, and then you have the epithalamus. So thalamus which is derived from the pars dorsalis is otherwise known as dorsal thalamus. Now what is metathalamus? Metathalamus, though it is considered as a different entity from thalamus because of its functions, it is actually considered under thalamus. And in metathalamus we have the geniculate bodies, the medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body. We know the medial and lateral geniculate bodies, they are dealing with the hearing as well as vision. Now coming to the epithalamus. Epithalamus consists of the pineal gland, the habenula nuclei and commissure, and the posterior commissure. These are the three important components of epithalamus. So all together the thalamus, metathalamus and epithalamus all together forms the pars dorsalis part of the diencephalon which is lying dorsal to the hypothalamic sulcus. Now coming to the part which is lying ventral to the hypothalamic sulcus. That is known as pars ventralis, and in it we have the subthalamus as well as the hypothalamus. So all these are termed thalamus but with different prefixes. So subthalamus actually is also known as ventral thalamus because it is lying in the pars ventralis portion, and it is actually made up of subthalamic nuclei and zona incerta, whereas hypothalamus we know it is a group of hypothalamic nuclei. Now with this, we should know how this thalamus is oriented. Now we are more focusing on this thalamus. That is the component which is seen on the dorsal aspect and hence called dorsal thalamus. So thalamus is an ovoid mass of grey matter. Most of the time when I ask my students, most of them say there is only one thalamus. So it's not like that. We have two thalami, two ovoid group of grey matter which are lying on either side of the midline. Okay. So what is the cavity which is lying between the two ovoid masses of thalami? That cavity is known as third ventricle. So when you take any part of the brain, you can see a ventricle related to it. Suppose if you take cerebral hemispheres, you have the lateral ventricle. Suppose if you take thalami, in between the thalami you have the third ventricle. In the midbrain you have the cerebral aqueduct. Then you have the pons and medulla and cerebellum, and between them you have the fourth ventricle. So at least one ventricle is related to each part of the brain. So for thalamus, between the two thalami you have the third ventricle. Okay. Now, when you look at these, the alignment of these thalami, we can see that it's not like you have a midline and you have two group of grey matter lying on either side. It's not like that. It is actually aligned obliquely so that the anterior end comes closer, whereas the posterior ends are separated. The anterior end of the thalamus is known as tubercle of thalamus, and the posterior broader end of the thalamus is known as pulvinar. Okay, so tubercle and pulvinar, and anteriorly they are connected by a group of grey matter that is known as interthalamic connexus. Normally when we speak about the connecting links, like suppose if we talk about corpus callosum, it is white matter. But here it's an exception. In the interthalamic connexus is not white matter, it is a group of grey matter. Now, why it is separated at the posterior aspect? We can see that it has to accommodate some of the important structures posteriorly. That is, one is habenullar triangle, then you have the superior colliculus, and then you have the pineal gland. So 1, 2 and 3, habenullar triangle, superior colliculus and pineal gland. So in order to accommodate these structures posteriorly, the two ends, the two broader ends of the thalamus are separated from each other. Now, what about the length of the thalamus roughly? It is roughly 3.5 centimeters. And what about the breadth of the thalamus? It is roughly 1.5 centimeters. Now, we know what is thalamus, which part of the diencephalon it is derived from. Then we know how it is oriented, what do you call the anterior end, posterior end, and why the posterior end is separate, staying separate, because to accommodate three important structures. Now coming to the surfaces. Surfaces, when you talk about thalamus, we have a superior surface, we have an inferior surface, you have a lateral surface and a medial surface. Superior surface, as we see here, laterally it is actually forming most of the part of the lateral ventricle, whereas medially it is actually the choroid plexus of the third ventricle coming in relation with the superior surface. Okay, so superior surface is related mostly to the lateral ventricle, and medial portion is related to the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. Now coming to the medial aspect we can see that it is in relation with the third ventricle. So the medial aspect of the thalamus is actually forming the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Now laterally, what do you have? Laterally we can see that it is actually forming or it is actually seen in relation with the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And inferiorly, in the anterior aspect, they are connected to each other by subthalamus, and posteriorly it is overhanging, the pulvinar is overhanging the geniculate bodies and the superior colliculus. Okay, so these are the different aspects of thalamus. You have the superior surface mostly related to the ventricle, medial surface mostly related to the third ventricle, lateral surface to the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and inferiorly, anteriorly, you can see that the thalami are connected with the subthalamus, whereas posteriorly it is actually overhanging. Now, there are two more important concepts which you should be knowing. One is known as trimedullaris thalami. Where will you look for the stria medullaris thalami? At the junction of the superior surface and medial surface, you can see a group of white matter that is known as stria medullaris thalami. And one more structure which you need to know is taenia thalami. What is taenia thalami? You know there is third ventricle lying between the two thalami. The ependymal lining of the third ventricle will be actually getting reflected towards the top of the or the superior surface of the third ventricle, connecting which is lying between the two thalami. The ependymal lining of the third ventricle, which is actually getting reflected medially, that is known as the taenia thalami. So these are some of the important aspects which you should be knowing before we move on to the detailed structure of thalamus, like the grey matter, white matter and all. Please continue watching. I will be uploading soon.